Welcome to Black Spot. On April 13th, 2024, the world watched in horror as a knife attack unfolded in a busy Sydney shopping center. You probably remember the headlines, right? A lone attacker, a lone hero. A simple, shocking story. But that story, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. In this explainer, we're going to peel back those headlines to ask a much tougher question. Was this just a random act of violence, or was it the tragic and maybe even predictable outcome of a system that's been quietly breaking down for years? Let's get into it.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with the attack itself, those terrifying 6 minutes. Then we'll look at the incredible courage that rose up from the middle of that chaos. From there, we have to look at the attacker, Joel Cockey, not to make excuses, but to understand the collapse of the systems that were supposed to be there. And that's when we'll get into the real heart of it, the massive gap between the story we were all told and the much, much more complicated truth. All right, let's set the scene. It was a totally normal Saturday afternoon at Westfield Bondi Junction, one of Sydney's busiest malls. People shopping, families out, you know the vibe. But in the space of just 6 minutes, that normalcy was completely shattered. What's just staggering is how fast this all happened. It starts at 3:32 p.m., and over the next 6 minutes, it is just pure chaos as the attacker moves through the mall. By 3:38 p.m., police have arrived, and it's over. Just think about that. 6 minutes. That's all it took to change so many lives forever. And in those 6 minutes, 6 people's lives were tragically cut short. We need to say their names. Dawn Singleton, who was out shopping for makeup for her wedding. Jade Young, a mother and architect. Yik Swan Cheng, an international student. Ashley Good, a new mom protecting her baby. Faraz Tahir, a security guard who had fled persecution to find safety in Australia. And Pikria Darchia, an artist. We remember them. But, even in the middle of all that terror, something else emerged. Just incredible acts of courage from police and from ordinary people just trying to get through their Saturday. This is the part of the story you probably remember seeing everywhere. That instinct to protect others, even when your own life is on the line. And at the center of it all was Inspector Amy Scott. Just listen to her own words from the inquest. In my head, I had resigned myself to the fact that I was probably going to die. Wow. Let that sink in. This wasn't just another call for her. She was walking into a situation fully believing she might not walk out. That tells you everything you need to know about the danger she was facing. And yet, look at what she did. With methodical calm. She gets there, she's the only cop on scene, no partner, no protective vest. She just goes in. Shoppers are pointing he went that way. She follows their lead, tracks him up to the 5th floor, confronts him, and neutralizes the threat. It is literally textbook training executed under the most extreme pressure imaginable. And to really get a handle on how incredible that is, you need to understand the protocol. Normally, in an active armed offender situation, you go in with a partner, you're wearing a ballistic vest, and even then, the training says you have a 60 to 70% chance of not making it out alive. She had none of that. She was alone, unprotected, and she still ran toward the danger. And you know what? She wasn't completely alone in that moment. There were also civilian heroes. You've probably seen the footage. These 2 French construction workers, Damien Garot and Silas Disbro, they grabbed these heavy bollards and just stood their ground on an escalator, blocking the attacker's path. That split-second decision, it didn't just save lives, it helped funnel the attacker right toward Inspector Scott. Absolutely heroic. Okay, so we have the victims, and we have the heroes. But now we have to turn to the hardest part of this story. We need to talk about the man who did this, Joel Cockey. And let's be absolutely clear, this is not about making excuses for his horrific actions. Not at all. It's about trying to understand all the pieces that led to this tragedy. At the very heart of Cockey's story is a lifelong battle with mental illness. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia way back when he was just 17. Now, this is a really serious disorder that, when it goes untreated, can completely distort a person's reality. And for him, this was a central fact of his life. As investigators started digging, what they found was a portrait of a man who had fallen through every single crack. Here's a guy who's 40 years old, drifting, effectively homeless, after moving to a new city. And crucially, he'd stopped taking his medication years ago. His behavior got more and more erratic. He developed this fixation on knives. And then he started searching online for mass casualty events. like Columbine. The warning signs were all there, blinking bright red.
And that is where this story gets so much bigger than just one person. This isn't just about one man's illness. It's about the slow, silent collapse of the very healthcare and social support systems that are designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening.
60. Just 60. That's the number of national and state inquiries there have been into Australia's mental health services since the 1990s. And get this, many of them were started right after a tragedy just like this one. So you have to ask, right? Why do we keep studying the same problem over and over again without ever seeming to actually fix it?
A psychiatrist, Professor Ian Hickey, really hits the nail on the head. He explains that the core failure here was disconnection. See, when Kochi was stable and had a place to live back in Queensland, his treatment was actually working. But the moment he moved, became homeless, and was cut off from his support network, poof, he just became invisible to the system. And this isn't some abstract concept. Look at these numbers. This is what the decay of that social safety net looks like in the real world. In 1991, Sydney had over 1,100 short-stay hostel beds, places where someone in crisis could get a roof over their head, a meal, and psychiatric care. And today, that number is less than 300. We have systematically dismantled the very infrastructure that's meant to help. The inquest also uncovered a critical failure in his direct medical care. Turns out, Cauchy's psychiatrist back in Queensland had been the one to wean him off his antipsychotic medication. And when she testified, her answers were described as belligerent and confusing. She even tried to argue the attack had nothing to do with psychosis before she had to walk it back. It was so concerning it has prompted calls for a professional review of her conduct. So you have all these long-term systemic failures, but what about the response in the moment? Well, it turns out there were cracks there too. Even with all those individual acts of heroism, the overall emergency response was slowed down by some pretty serious communication breakdowns. The inquest revealed it was like a cascade of failures. The one person watching the mall's security cameras, they happened to be on a bathroom break right when the attack started. The mall-wide emergency alarm, it didn't go off until after the attacker was already down. Police knew there was only one attacker, but that critical message was never passed on to the ambulance commander. This delayed paramedics from getting in to treat the wounded, and even they didn't have immediate access to their own protective ballistic gear. Each one is a crack in a system that's supposed to be seamless in a crisis. Okay, so let's step back and bring all of this together. On one side, we have this story that we all saw on the news cycle, the simple, shocking headline. And on the other, we have this complex, messy, and frankly uncomfortable reality that's been uncovered by the inquest. The narrative we were all sold is simple and compelling. A monster appears out of nowhere, and a hero stops him. But the underlying reality is that this was a preventable tragedy. This was the predictable endpoint of decades of neglecting mental health care, of underfunding crisis housing, and of failing to have solid response protocols. The event was the symptom. The system was the disease. And you know what happens in that information vacuum? Misinformation rushes in. For hours after the attack, false claims spread like wildfire online, wrongly identifying the attacker and blaming terrorism. It just goes to show how much more comforting it is for people to grab onto a simple, hateful motive rather than confront a complex, systemic truth. This all leaves us with a really difficult question. An individual is always responsible for their actions, of course, but what is our collective responsibility for the systems that fail them so completely? The story of Bondi Junction isn't just about one man's horrific rampage. It's about the cracks in our society that we choose to ignore, right up until a tragedy like this forces us to look. The real question isn't just how this happened, but whether we'll finally have the courage to fix the system before it happens again. Thanks for joining us on Black Spot. If you want to keep digging into the stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe.